Well, thank you for coming. I honestly didn't expect, I thought maybe there'd be like 10, I thought there'd be maybe 10 people or so.
The $20 helped.
My doctor's here too tonight. That's good. Actually, to be an FBI agent, law school is one way to get in. An accountant, science degree can be a key. Or you can get a BA or BS and then use and have 3 years of some other kind of work. And that's one way to get in. In the class that I was in, we had someone that came out of a seminary, former priest, a couple military guys, and there's a wide range of people. So and quite frankly, from my standpoint, it was a great career. I spent 4.5 years, bulk of it in New York City, and I really enjoyed it. And it's a super group of people to be with and to work with, and it was fun. And New York was another place that I truly enjoyed. I know it's a tough life when you're there, although I was single at the time. But it's very intense. It's almost as if people, when you are on the street, are spoiling for a fight. And sometimes, like a potted plant, thirsty for water, you'd respond in kind. I would come home, and my mother would say, "Geez, what's happened to you?" And I said, "Mom, it's the city. It's tough." And she and I would tip outrageously high, stuff like that. But anyway, I mean, and Southern guys had a real tough time adapting when they were there, and there was a lot of Southern guys. And one piece of advice that was always given to me by a North Carolina agent was that, hey, you're going to go home and your mom won't recognize you as her boy because it changes, your life changes. New York City, with the Bureau, was probably the most aggressive in terms of cases. It had the hottest, most significant stuff that came out of New York City. And quite frankly, when you got there and you started working, you'd get a bit, what's the word I want, arrogant? You get a little insolent and haughty because you always felt you were the cream of the crop. And you really went out, and there was always the intensity and the constant approach to cases to, hey, be aggressive, be tough, don't make mistakes. And if you make mistakes, you're on your own. I don't want to hear about it. That would be kind of the supervisor's mentality. It was kind of leave no fingerprints on cases, and if somebody screws up, the agent would be the one that. But you know what? That never really bothered me at the time, and most of the people that I worked with, particularly if you didn't plan on kind of making it a long-term career. For me, it was 4.5 years. And I think at that point, generally, most people would then decide at about that time frame if they want to make it a career or not. But in any event, it was extremely rewarding for me. And I don't know, the way I got started with this book, it really is it's a 1968. The time to understand it, I think you have to go back and understand the time frame of 1968. Dave Ziegler and Cindy, Dave invited me, I don't know, some time ago. We all went up to Chicago. There's an exhibit at the Chicago History Museum of just the year 1968, and it was probably the watershed year, a seminal year with an historic year in modern times. There was dissent. If you have to obviously look at what was happening. You had the Vietnam War. You had the Tet Offensive, which started right the first part of the year. You had people that were dying, getting killed, probably on a weekly basis, the same number that were killed in 9/11. And then you had, during the year, you had a lot of two fallen leaders. So you had Martin Luther King get assassinated. You had Robert Kennedy get assassinated. You had a lot of massive demonstrations and riots. There was a lot of rage, anger, and hysterical opposition. And it was like when you left the office, which at the time was located in Midtown, and you hit the street. I mean, it was brutal in the sense that what was happening is that all of this kind of dissension and rage brought about and kind of spawned a lot of malcontent people, and also different student bodies like SDS, Students for Democratic Society. You had the Black Panthers. You had the Weathermen, which was a group that was a little more violent. But anyway, and all of these groups started existing and becoming, creating a lot of havoc. And there was, I don't know if you can think back to that time frame, there was also a lot of cities that were having riots and burning and all that stuff. And then, to top that off, what was happening is that the Russians got involved. And in New York, you've got all of these consulates to the United Nations. In Washington, D.C., of course, you got embassies. But there would be these legal bases for these communist groups in Russia, but which was kind of where I was at the time. When I went in there, for some reason, and I don't know why, because I'm not a Russian-speaking agent, or Russian-speaking, but somehow I got assigned to the Russian espionage kind of counterintelligence squad, which is where they threw me. And the Russians, they have a kind of a consulate on East 67th Street. At the time, they had like 350 Russians that were there. A lot of them bring in their families. And they love it. It's a feather in their cap when you look at the fact that the U.S. is probably the number one target. And so all of the Russians come in, and ostensibly they work down at the UN as attachés and cultural things, stuff like that. But in fact, they were intelligent officers, and they were there to get information. And they were there to contact people, military people, engineers, attend conventions. And our job was kind of to counteract that. When they came in, they would come in, and their first tour would be 6 months. And while they were there for 6 months, the first part, they wouldn't know uptown from downtown. They wouldn't know that, hey, there's only 6 ways to get off Manhattan unless you go by helicopter. And they wouldn't know the ins and outs of New York City and blah, blah, blah. And they were there just kind of to get acclimated. And initially, from our perspective, we wouldn't worry about them. We kind of just let them go, and because we knew that they were not going to be out there trying to do anything and be dirty and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so at the end of 6 months, then they would normally go back to the Soviet Union, and they go back to spy school, maybe spend a month or two. And then I'd be sitting at my desk, and the supervisor would come over and say, hey, Joe, your guy, Yuri, is coming back. And so we would meet. I'd meet him at the airport. I'd see him at the airport. We'd go out, a couple guys. And now all of a sudden, instead of a guy that arrived 6 months earlier wearing heavy shoes, heavy sole black shoes and baggy suits and blah, blah, blah. Now they get off the plane, and it's like a horse of a different color. I mean, they're Hickey Freeman shoes and Brittany kind of British clothing, and they look westernized, and now they're a different person. And now, however, now they got to produce. They got to go out, get contacts, do this, do that, and get information. And if they don't produce, then they will go back home, and they don't want to go back home because America and living here is really a great thing for them. I mean, they'd have a summer place out at the Rockaways, and they like to shop, and their families are here, and it's a great life. So in any event, then the business picks up from an agent's point of view. And now we know that, hey, now we got to start covering them, and because now they're going to be serious, and we've got to go out and get individuals contacts where they may have contacts. And obviously, so the upshot, what we try to do is identify, Americans perhaps that will meet with them. And we also, if we're lucky, if you get lucky, you try to get them to come to our side and as like a defector in place. And then that's the ideal thing, because now you got somebody inside the mission, and you've got somebody that can provide you with everything you need in terms of opening up new cases, Americans, illegals, stuff like that. Anyway, so that was the kind of work I was doing, and it was fun. I mean, I honestly look back at that. I mean, there's a lot of times, I talked to my supervisor, and he said, hey, there's a part of this job you're not going to like. And I say, well, what's that? He said, well, you're going to be out there on a surveillance, and it can be very boring. I would walk. I didn't have a car then. New York City. I was living in an apartment, and you try to hold down expenses. Fortunately, you get to know the ins and outs of where to eat. Ate a lot at delis. But what the supervisor would emphasize is that, hey, you're going to be on a surveillance, and it's going to get boring. I mean, there's just no activity. And then all of a sudden something pops, and every now and then you know that the person's going to be doing something, because he's bailing in and out of subways and stuff like that. Now normally I'd be out there. If I was out there with a Russian, there'd be more than one person. I mean, there'd be several agents doing this kind of stuff. But anyway, so that's kind of the background for this 1968 kind of book I put out. I don't know, it just kind of started thinking about it. I mean, it's not like, what happened, about several years ago, I took a creative writing course at the University of Chicago. And most of the people that were in there, they were all college grads. I think 50% of them were lawyers. I don't know, you get now Scott Turrell and Grisham, and I think everyone was kind of maybe saying, hey, that's not a bad way to go out and do things. But what I came away with, and I think if some of you are interested in writing, I mean, it's probably a good place to start. I mean, a creative writing course. I would not recommend doing it every year. I mean, there's people that go out to the Iowa, out at the University of Iowa for writing each summer, and that to me can get old. And I think once you take the course, and if you're interested in writing, then you just got to get out there and you got to do it. Now, fortunately, several years back, I started writing for the Journal, and that helps. I mean, because now I was forced, in addition to practicing law, of course, I was writing for and I'm still writing for the Journal, although I do it generally with Ken Johnston. And that's fun, although it's it's a little different from writing a book like this. The book is a novel, although it doesn't take a ton of imagination when the bulk of the stuff that's in there has actually happened. I mean, that kind of helps you if you're going to start writing. But anyway, after this course that I took, what I came away with was a feeling, and I think that I've seen this expressed by some writers like Roth and Styron, both of whom had kind of depression issues. And going to analysis, and they'd see people like Dr. Zegos up here for counseling. but anyway, but I came away from this course. I mean, the way it was taught was give it hell and give it your heart and your guts, and it got really emotional with people. I mean, what I noticed coming out of that class, I mean, you'd write some things and then you'd have to talk about it, and then you got a group of hotshots critiquing what was said. And what I noticed, I mean, some of these, I mean, they'd get up and start talking, and it's emotional, and tears would be going down their cheeks, and I think that writing is kind of a release. Now, I don't know if Cindy for example, would agree with that, but I think it's a release if you're suffering from depression and psychological issues. I mean, you can express yourself on paper. And then it kind of lets everything out, and you walk away a little better. I mean, but that's kind of what I came away with, at least from that course I took. And in the other thing that she tried to emphasize was spontaneity, like writing like Jack Kerouac, on the road, and speed writing, doing it quickly, first person. And it was like a confessional, That's kind of what they kind of expressed to do. But then at the end of the day, I mean, if you're interested in writing, you just got to start doing it. I don't know. This book I worked on kind of on weekends and stuff like that. I don't know. I think it's decent stuff. I think you can learn a little bit. And the fact of publishing is another separate topic, I suppose. If somebody is interested in wanting to know how to publish, I mean, by all means, if you want to call me or email me, I'll be happy to steer you somewhere. But anyway, but again, it was the year of '68 and all the problems that occurred that kind of got me started. And then the New York City, the intensity and working in New York, and the attitude we had with agents, it just seemed like we were out there to kick butt at night. But when we hit the street, we were out there. We didn't waste time, and we really tried to rein in the bad. But anyway, that's about all I have to say. I don't know if you have. I don't know what more I could enlighten you on. Well, I got some ideas about something. If I can ever, if we get some of the things resolved, that to answer your question, I haven't flat out started. I think writing is difficult. I think Styron hit it right. It's tough. It's work. And it's not pleasant. And every now and then, like Robert Penn Warren's book, All the King's Men, I mean, he was a professor over at Yale, and a friend of mine who took one of his classes, they always asked Robert Penn Warren if he's going to do a sequel to All the King's Men. And his response was, well, I think I only had one book in me at the time, and although I think he wrote a little bit more, but writing is tough. But I really honestly would, if you've got that initiative, and I think it can be rewarding. Not necessarily financially, but it can help you. But anyway, I don't know what more to say.
Joe,
Yeah.
did you ever get a chance to watch the series, The Americans?
Well, Sandra watched that, and she watches Homeland. You know, there was a time with the Americans, I think, had to do with illegals. Illegals were, no, not true.
The Americans were actually Russian spies set in America, but they were brought in not to work out of the consulate, but actually to live as American citizens, kind of like sweepers. And then they would go out and infiltrate and try to create relationships that would allow them to gain information. It's a rather interesting series, and I was just wondering, based on your experiences,
Well,
you had alluded to some interesting things. I wondered if you want to share any
yeah.
interesting experiences.
Well, first of all, those kinds of individuals are called illegals.
Oh.
Illegals. What that means is they can infiltrate down through Canada, and then they come in here and they establish a legend. And the legend that they establish generally involves maybe finding a name of somebody who died with the same kind of that would be comparable to yourself, because you're going to have to apply for a Social Security card, and you're going to be late in getting it. But those are called illegals. What the FBI used to do, and they may very well still do, is that for example, if you get a defector in place, like, for example, let's assume my guy comes over to our side and I say, okay, stay in the mission. We want you in there because we want you to give us some information on stuff. And so he says, hey, I can give you information on illegals. And I've got some names, blah, blah, blah. And now, obviously, you've got to be, one of the problems with getting defectors is that you never know if they're telling the truth or not. It's like going to a doctor, well, no, no, I didn't mean it that way. My point is this. Somebody goes to a doctor and says, Doc, I got a headache. Now, you either believe him or you don't. I don't think there's any way to diagnostically show, unless you got some sort of brain tumor, to show that the person is telling the truth, that he's got a headache or not. It's the same way when you interview these Russian guys, and fortunately we did. We had good luck with that. But a defector comes in, he says, I want to give you this, give you that, in exchange for maybe money. Some of them are just swindlers. And then they pop, and so you don't know if they're really telling the truth or not. But the point is that if you can get them to give you illegals, then that's really a feather in your cap. And yeah, that's what you want. But anyway, what the Bureau used to do, and maybe they still do, is when you have an illegal, and if you do the homework and you go out and do the little background investigation and maybe run a surveillance, maybe from an adjacent house to see, hey, who is this guy, And if you then become convinced that, yeah, he's an illegal, there's no, we've gotten this and this, then what we used to do, and I think they probably might still do, is you snatch him. You pick him up off the street. Now, do you remember that movie, Mississippi Burning? Where they snatched this Ku Klux Klan guy, and they put him in a room, scared the hell out of him. But anyway, you snatch him, and then you start interrogating him, and, you don't beat him with a rubber hose, obviously. You don't do that. You don't waterboard him. We never did any of that stuff. But anyway, the snatching part we did do, and And then you just interrogate them and convince them that, hey, I mean, we know what you're up to. And then after that, well, then, I don't know, you might trade him for somebody over in the Soviet Union or do something else. Or you might, depending on how nasty he is, you might just indict him at some point and then just. But in any event, that is done. That was done. When you do stuff with Russia, when you do things with internal security, as opposed to the New Left and working with the Black Panthers, I mean those are Americans. There's really a different. You've got to be a little more careful there. But with internal security, you got a ton of leeway. For example, I mean, snatching a car to put on a device of some sort, that was kind of routinely done, even though the Russians would probably sweep their cars and they may find the device. But it was a way to keep track of them in the city. And just put a device on it. Normally you would do that at night. You'd take the car from the space, drive it down to the FBI kind of shop. Someone would come in, install it, and run a sensor back to the tailpipe, and then it would go. It would operate when the engine was running. But anyway, and then there'd be a second FBI car that would take the same space, and then you just take the car back and park it. They rarely would not. Well, the only time they would find that is if they later on swept the car, so to speak, and found some stuff, which they regularly did. But I don't know. I mean, you got a ton more leeway. I guess that's really the point I wanted to make with doing internal security and Russian stuff. And that's probably the way things happen in New York City still. I mean, I'm sure they're doing the same thing I was doing back in '68. Did I turn my guy? Well, we won't discuss that. But we had good luck when we were there. And I don't know. I just think it's again, it's being aggressive. But that, what I've noticed, I mean, even, in contrast to today, I mean, there's a lot of stuff happening out there in the world. I mean, you pick up the paper, and it just seems to be flooded with bad news. But then you think back and you say, well, wait a minute, think back to 1968 where they had all these demonstrations, all of this conflict and stuff. And I don't know, it just kind of, I think really it was really tough then. I mean, in that particular year was the culmination of a bad scene. I mean, it disrupted lives. He had the draft. He had Jed coming back. It interrupted his University of Illinois education. But, I mean, it was different then. I mean, and people, a lot of them, they didn't want, it was just the draft, I think, was probably the one thing that was the killer, among other things. But anyway.
So, Joe, if it became clear to the Russians that one of their people had turned, were they at risk, or were they going to witness protection?
Well, yeah, I mean, they could. Well, if they found out that so and so was providing information to the United States, they'd bring him back and take him back to Moscow, and he'd end up in they'd be executed. And there was a couple instances of that. I don't know. And I'm trying to think of a couple of the cases that happened. I don't know. Unfortunately, what you try to do, though, is instead of just having them come over and defect, what you try to do is keep them in place so that they can provide information. And then what we would do is we would give them like, for example, I mean, if we had this defector that came over, we would say, okay, we're going to give you some stuff. And we would provide them with, I hate to use the word medically, placebos or stuff. We'd give them stuff that was not, that looked good, but it would look as if that they were producing to keep them here in the United States. You'd give them information that was not that sensitive, and to help them out, to keep them producing, to keep them from avoiding them to go back home and stuff like that. Yes, Laura. That we would give them? Yeah. Well, you know what? I mean, you could pick up the New York Times and get information as to the location of all the Minuteman missiles. And I mean, much of what you have to remember when you get, if you're at the Soviet mission, you got people there that are quote-unquote readers. Every day, they go through all the magazines. I mean, ours is a much more open society, and now, even with the internet, it's probably even worse. I mean, so they got readers. They can get much of their information probably just from finding it in newspapers and magazines and on the internet, you know. But we would always try to give them something above that to make it look good. Stuff that might be marked secret or top secret, even though it wasn't, in fact, that sensitive. 70% of the stuff that we have is probably known by the Russians, and probably it's the same way from our side looking at what they do. So, anyway. Yes. No, that's a good question. Actually, when I got out of law school, again, the draft was in progress, and so much depended upon your local draft board at the time. But anyway, there were two of us in my class that went with the Bureau. And when we went with them, they said, well, Hoover will write a letter to your draft board. It may keep you out of the service. It may not keep you out. That's what we were told. It all depended upon the local draft board. They may take the position that, hey, you're doing something in service for the country. So as it turned out, and I was from Kankakee at the time, and my friend was from Chicago. So we had two different draft boards, but we both went in. But then when you bail out, I mean, you were still subject to the draft. I mean, if the draft was still in progress. So it wasn't a total deferment. Not to continue? I don't know. I mean, there was a point. Well, first of all, I met Sandra in New York, my wife, and we started dating. And then you start thinking long term, and I felt that I wanted to use my law degree. So actually, my last day in office was the day before I got married. And then I went down to Norris, and then we took off, and then I had a job with a law firm up in Chicago. So, it was more or less a feeling on my part that I wanted to try something else and wanted to use my law degree a bit more. So that's what I did. One of the things, Sandra, before I came up here, she said, well, why don't you say something about Hoover and stuff? Hoover was an interesting guy, and he had a lot of quirks. I mean, he was, one of the stories, and this is actually a true story, when you would go through the Bureau, you would be with a class, and you had 14 weeks of training. You spent a lot of time in D.C., and then you go down to Quantico for firearms training and all that stuff. But anyway, Hoover's had a big, he wanted his agents to look good. He wanted them to be, because he said, hey, they're going out and meeting with people, and that was his big shtick. And there was one class, and he would make off-the-wall judgment calls. I mean, but the problem with Hoover was that everyone around him was afraid of him, and they didn't want to question him. And if he said, do this, you'd never ask the director why. You would just do it. Anyway, so before you would go out to your first office, the class, after you're done, after 14 weeks of training, the person that spent most of his time with you, the guy that was in charge of the class, said, well, the final thing that we do before you go out to your first office, we're going to go over to the director's office, and we're going to walk in a line, and the director's going to shake hands with you, and he's going to say, you're going to go out and kick butt. And I want you to look good. I want you to dress well, and I want you to be on your toes and don't make any comments to the director. And I mean, by the time he did all, they would build you up to a point that, holy cow, I mean, what, are we meeting the Pope or what? I mean, but anyway, so there's one class that went through. You walk through the line, and there's maybe like 20 guys. There weren't a lot of women in the late 60s going through the FBI. There were a few. But anyway, and so you'd be shaking hands with the director, and then off you go. And after the class went, one of the classes went through, the director commented to one of his high cohorts, and all he said was, get rid of that pinhead. Get rid of that what? Pinhead. Get rid of that pinhead. That's all he said. Now, he's got his cohorts there, and then after the director leaves, they rush back. He's pinhead. Who could that be? You know. So the class they went back, and believe it or not, these are grown men. I mean, you know, and you wonder what's going on with this stuff. They took hat sizes. I know this is, you know, Bob here is looking at, says, is this true? They took hat sizes. The two guys with the lowest hat size were removed from the bureau. That's a true story. Yeah. The two. There were other instances of bizarre stuff that occurred with Hoover. When I got admitted to the United States Supreme Court, one of the things that I was able to do was to go in and have a private conversation with him. That was true for anybody that went down to the D.C. and got admitted to the Supreme Court. You'd go in and you get your picture, and then you get it, and then they send it to you. They send you a picture. The director would come around his desk, and he had a little kind of a line that he towed, because one of the things that he always did, which is why he was so powerful, I think, over the years, because he started back in 1924, and you know he was there until he died. But everyone that came to D.C., when they go in to meet J. Edgar, they would all get pictures taken. I mean, you got cops and sheriffs and everybody that went through Quantico with firearms training. But anyway, so he built up a huge following, and that was, I think, one key as to why he was able to stay entrenched so long. I mean, he had a tremendous amount of people that supported him, and then he would send out these bulletins. But anyway, so I did have a private conversation with him, and I have to tell you, quite honestly, we talked a little bit about New York, and it was just the two of us. We were sitting there. And when I got back to New York, my supervisor called me in after about a week, and he said, I think you ought to shave your sideburns. You remember that we had long sideburns back in the 60s. And he said, we got a notice from the bureau. So I said, all right, shave my sideburns. You know, I mean, they were a little bit long. I don't know. And I had kind of a New York attitude, and I said, all right, you know. But anyway, he was different. And so, yes, Phil.
So, is there a difference between Secret Service and FBI?
Well, the Secret Service.
So why is FBI winning right now?
Well, FBI winning. Well, I don't know. I mean, it's just a total different.
Are they very equivalent in terms of the kind of people that are in those things? And if so, then how do you?
I don't know. I mean, it really depends upon how you feel about what you want to do. You know, if you come out of college, the thought of being a bodyguard, like with the Secret Service, I'm sure they're. I don't know. They seem to have gotten themselves into a lot of issues and messes recently. And quite honestly, we didn't have a lot of contact with those guys. One time, my fellow agent and I, we happened to be up in the Waldorf Astoria, and we ran into a few of them. But we didn't have much contact with the Secret Service. We also didn't have a lot of contact with CIA guys, and we didn't look at them as. Let me put it this way, as politely as I can, because Denny Merrick, of course, is a columnist, and he's got a CIA background. But we always had different views, not Denny and I, but the Bureau agents and the CIA. We got along, but we're like two dogs walking down the street, and your fur'd go up when you see the other dog. We looked at them as bright Ivy guys, but we didn't really look at them as street guys with any degree of savviness when it came to dealing with people. I mean, they would come in, and every now and then, when I was in New York, one would come over and talk about defectors and Russians and stuff. But they were always it's like they didn't really totally share what they knew, and they kind of gave you tidbits and little stuff like that. But we didn't have a great regard for them, frankly. I mean, it was just the two services. I mean, we got along civilly, but I don't think that, and I don't know if that is still today, if that's the relationships that they see today. I don't know. It's hard to say. I don't know. I haven't. Yes, sir.
What kind of a weekly work schedule do you have in the FBI? I would imagine it's not just
Well,
and then do you have to submit your book to the FBI?
I didn't hear the second question.
If you have to submit your book to the FBI.
No, I didn't do that. No, I didn't do that. I just figured, hey, 68, 32 years plus 14, I know that didn't bother me. No, to answer your question, I didn't do it. I don't know if they want to talk about it, they know where to reach me. But it was always 8:15. You had to kind of sign in, and you had to have a little bit of overtime every day. So you'd sign in, and then you'd sign out when you went home, and so it was a long day. You spend most of your time. They didn't want you necessarily around the desk. They wanted you out there working, out there gathering information, And the beauty of it was, I mean, I don't know at the time. I don't know. All lawyers are different. I don't know. Dave, just trying to think of how he felt when he got out of law school. When I got out of law school, I wasn't really ready to write wills and sit in an office. I just wanted to be out there on the street. And that was the great part of it. I mean, you run in and you talk to a lot of people during the day. You spend a lot of time just gathering facts and information. I think nowadays it's probably even worse. I mean, if you think about the terrorism issues. Because every time you call in, if you happen to call in to the Bureau and you say, hey, there's somebody over here talking about guns and doing this and doing that, they're going to follow every lead. And every time you do that, and if you can imagine nationwide, how many leads you have to keep following to make sure that you don't maybe overlook something, and then all of a sudden now it comes back to slap you in the face. You just can't do that. I don't know. I just think it's got to be really tough with this terrorism stuff and people with guns. And anyway. Yes.
Getting back to the Hoover situation, I've read somewhere that Hoover was like a cold warrior type. He did, and that was to the detriment of looking at American society with respect to the mafia. He never, I thought there was a famous quote, he didn't think the mafia was that much of a problem, or foreign espionage was a problem. Number one, is that true? And number two was Hoover's control of the people that we're talking about. Was that fed because he had a lot of information on people that wasn't used but could be used? I mentioned this goes along with the Kennedy brothers' exploits sexually.
Well, he did, to answer the last question first, I guess, he had these files on everybody. And
Did he ever threaten it with their idea, he got the file and he left no questions that he would be used?
well, you know what? I'm sure that probably was the case where I don't know if he actually would express that to individuals that were in Congress and stuff like that. I mean, he had a ton of information there and people were afraid of him because of that fact. I mean, I don't know. I beg your pardon? John Lennon? I didn't hear you, I'm sorry. Okay. Well, like I say, I'm not denying that. He had a ton of information on just about, on just about everybody. I mean, if you go in and you needed some sort of FBI background, I mean, the file was there. And he had I don't know if he had secret files on individuals that were high up in government. And she probably was correct with John Lennon. I'm not disputing that at all. I mean,
What about the Cold Warrior mentality?
well, you got to, if you go back, I mean, he was always chasing commies, and I mean that was his mentality, and that continued probably not just the 50s, but into the 60s. I mean. And there were agents that would go out and interview these old emigres that had come over here with maybe a communist background or something like that. I don't know. To me, it got to the point it was just a waste of time. But then again, I mean, if that's what he wanted, and the director, and if of direction came down like that, then you would do it. Anyway, yes.
A while ago, you said that if the FBI wanted to get hold of you, they knew where to find you. And I'm curious to know, once you leave the FBI, are you under surveillance for a period of time to make sure you're not you, but that an agent would not be...
Well, I mean, we've had, I don't know, I think there was at least one agent, and I don't know, I can't recall his name, that was one of the bad guys. But I mean, I don't know. One of the chapters in the book, I talk about paranoia being good. We had the supervisor that I had was paranoid, and then he would say, "Well, paranoia is good. I mean, you want to be paranoid because you want to be careful and keep your ear to the ground. Be careful about even your associates within the bureau." I don't know. I at least when I was there, I never really questioned anything about the associates that I came into contact with. I don't know. Everyone seemed like they were out there. But anyway, to answer your question, there was that you always looked at to some degree, although I didn't pay much attention to it.
As for your prose, is there a section of the book, as we will read it, that we should pay special attention to, that maybe you really worked the craft of writing in, and you're really pleased with page X or what, 232 or something? Could you you read some of your work possibly from the book?
Do what now?
Is there a favorite part of the book that you're really pleased at your writing
Oh.
that you would maybe share with readers?
Well, I mean, you might skip over to my introduction to New York, where I'm trying to think of the chapter. It's probably in the middle. I was kind of pleased with that. I don't know. In the first chapter, what I did, I had a long sentence that had to win a page. A long sentence. And I just kind of, somehow when I started writing that, I said, gee, maybe I'll do something like Ginsberg. Remember Ginsberg's Howl, the poem Howl? And it went on and on and on and on. I said, hey, I'll try that, and I did. I threw it in there. I don't know. Someone, I'm a member of the Union League Club, and one of the nice things about the Union League is that they have a writers group, and then we go up and we chit chat, and there's other writers from Chicago, but they were asking me about that sentence, and I thought that was pretty cool on my part. I don't know, but it worked out well. I think that was, and then Tor, I think the writing, and I don't know, that you can form your own opinion. I think it gets better toward the end than the initial parts, maybe a little bit boring. But anyway, yeah.
When you're getting ready to leave the FBI and thereafter, you probably have some information that is of a sensitive nature within yourself. Do they, do you get some sort of training in resisting torture, or do you have to make a pledge that you will never reveal this information?
No, not really. No, it's like leaving corporate America. They have a going away party for you, give you a few gifts. My dad worked for the Chicago Daily News for 56 years. 56 years. And when he finally ended his career, he went up to Chicago. They had a little going away party. They gave him a watch. And that was it. You don't get anything when you leave the Bureau. I mean, they don't ask you to take a pledge. And what did trouble me a little bit was, not trouble, but is that if I were going to fly to the Soviet Union, that might then, I think now probably Putin wouldn't really care if I came in there or not. But I think they probably know who you are, and they then might try to, approach you to do something to help their side, I suppose. I think that's probably the case. We had, I don't know if this is getting a little off track, but we had a campaign in New York one day, and the campaign had to be dreamt up by some meathead down with some think tank down in D.C. It was called the Smile Campaign. And you came into the office, and they said, hey, guys, we're going to start something new. This is a new directive that's come in from D.C. And it's called we want you to start smiling at the Russians. Smiling. And the idea was thought up by somebody down in D.C. And when we, that if you kept smiling at them, they would look at you as nice guys, and maybe then they would try to come over and actually defect and do something. So, that day I recall I left the office, and my friend said, let the rain be your umbrella on this smiley, smiley day. And I left the office smiling, and when I encountered my guy on the street, I'd smile at him, smile, 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 and you'd say, geez, come on, Yuri, smile, it's not so bad. You never got a smile back. It was just a kind of a ridiculous campaign that lasted only a very short time. But the problem was that it identified the individuals from the office. I mean, it showed them who these guys are, which was kind of stupid, really. And so, anyway. Well, listen, thank you all for...
One more question. With respect to the lady's previous question, and you hear it about law enforcement, in addition to other professions, was there a code of silence, basically an unwritten code of silence within the FBI? In other words, things were not on the up and up, but he just kept quiet. Not with respect to Hoover. I'm not talking about being threatened by Hoover. I'm just talking about within the agency itself.
Well, let me put it this way. When I got to New York, as I mentioned, New York was different. We had an attitude there. And I thought that the guys there, in contrast to the other offices, I think that we were haughty and insolent, and we felt that we were the best. I think our motivations were good, but often we would skirt the law in the sense of search and seizure, sometimes. And by that I mean, let's assume you have a slam dunk case, a criminal case. And sometimes in the course of a slam dunk case, when you know there's going to be a conviction, if you had to skirt the law and maybe seize something without a warrant, maybe violating the Fourth Amendment, you knew that if you did that, you're still going to win because it was a slam dunk case. And when you get in the courtroom, as some of the lawyers here probably would tell you, it's only the fruit of the poisonous tree that gets thrown out, which means that if you got something that you took that you should not have taken but did, the rest of it will still go in to evidence, so you don't lose the case. So that kind of attitude was prevalent. And the one chapter that somebody asked me about in terms of writing, where you're in the office, when you're in the FBI office, and you're interviewing an informant. Normally, there were two people that would interview an informant, but if I second shared it, where for something ridiculous, the agent just clobbered him, clobbered the informant in the office, and it could be something as for the fact that the informant was getting a little fresh with maybe one of, and I wrote about this in the book, a little fresh with one of the little FBI clerks, you know. And you kind of sit there and you see the informant go down, and geez, is this the way it is? And then afterward, you kind of wonder to yourself, if you just get out of law school and said, well, geez, maybe that's the reason why we have an ACLU. But then when you report it, you don't report it, you just omit it. Now, if maybe that's what you're referring to.
And other people.
But you know what? I don't think I ever saw these, like you see some of these shootings, which is really makes me perplexed, where you see Chicago cops in a video kind of shooting somebody like that. You know, our approach with guns was always, you never shoot a person in the back. You never pull your gun unless you fear for your life or somebody else's life, or if he's pointing a gun at a shopkeeper or somebody. But then you don't just plug away kind of in a fruitless fashion. You know. And I see some of the stuff that happens. It's almost as if that some of the cops, are not really trained that well. I'm not saying that's a problem locally. Don't get me wrong on that. But if you look at what's happened around the country from time to time, that seems to be an issue that maybe more training or something needs to be done. I don't know. How many here anybody have a concealed carry license? No. We won't talk about that. Anyway, thank you very much for coming.